You know the story. A monster, a maze, a hero. Theseus goes in, kills the beast, comes out a legend. But here's what nobody asks. What was the monster doing in there before Theseus arrived? Was he hunting, raging, waiting to kill? No, he was playing alone, in the dark, for years, inventing games for himself, talking to imaginary friends, waiting not to kill someone, but for someone, anyone, to finally set him free. The monster had a name, not the Minotaur. That was never his name. That was the name they gave him after they decided what he was. His real name was Asterion, and it meant the Starry One, a creature named after the stars, who never once in his life saw the sky. This is not the story of a monster. This is the story of what happens when the powerful need someone to blame. To understand Asterion, you have to start before he was born, with his stepfather, King Minos. Minos was the most powerful ruler in the ancient Mediterranean world. His island of Crete dominated the seas. His palace at Knossos, a building so vast and so complex that ancient Greeks remembered it as a labyrinth itself, was the center of civilization. He had everything. And then he made one mistake. Poseidon, god of the sea, sent Minos a gift, a white bull, perfect, magnificent, sacred, an animal so beautiful it seemed to belong to the gods. Poseidon's instruction was simple. Sacrifice the bull, return it to me. Minos looked at the bull, and he kept it. One act of greed, one moment of, I want this for myself. And Poseidon's revenge was not directed at Minos, it was directed at his wife. Queen Pasiphae was innocent. She had done nothing. She had stolen nothing. She had made no bargain with any god. But the gods of ancient Greece didn't punish the guilty. They punished whoever was most convenient. Poseidon cursed her, and from that curse, a child was born. Half man, half bull, Asterion. He didn't ask to exist. He didn't choose what he was. He was the price paid for someone else's greed. Here is a detail that almost every version of this myth skips over. Before the labyrinth, before the sacrifices, before any of it, Asterion walked outside. Just once. The ancient sources tell us that when the people of Crete saw him, they ran. Not because he attacked them, not because he threatened them, not because he did anything, but because of what he looked like. Imagine being a child walking out into sunlight for the first time, seeing people, streets, life, and watching every single person turn and flee from you in absolute terror. Not because of who you are, because of what you look like. Minos watched this happen, and he made a decision. Not, how do I help this child? Not, how do I explain to my people that he is harmless? He called the architect Daedalus, the greatest engineer in the ancient world, and he said, build me something that no one can escape from. The labyrinth was not built to contain a monster. It was built to hide an embarrassment. Asterion was locked underground not because he was dangerous, but because his existence was inconvenient. Because the king couldn't look at his stepson without being reminded of his own sin. Now here's the part of the story that was buried so deeply that it took until 1947 for someone to finally tell it. An Argentine writer named Jorge Luis Borges wrote a story from inside the labyrinth, from Asterion's point of view. And what he described, based on the original ancient sources, is one of the most heartbreaking things ever written about any mythological figure. Asterion lived in a house with endless rooms, identical corridors that stretched forever, identical stone walls, identical ceilings, identical darkness. He could not count the rooms. He could not find the end of any hallway. He could not find the sky, so he invented games. He would run through the corridors, pretending he was being chased. He would hide, and then pretend to find himself. He invented a second Asterion in his mind, an imaginary companion, just to have someone to speak to. Every 9 years, a group of Athenians was sent in. 7 men, 7 women. The official story says Asterion devoured them. But Borges, reading the ancient texts carefully, noticed something. The texts never describe Asterion hunting them. The texts never describe him as hungry, as violent, as aggressive. What the texts describe is a creature who, when confronted with these strangers, simply approached them, and they died of fear. The monster who devoured tributes may have been a lonely creature who simply walked toward the first human beings he had seen in years, and they killed themselves fleeing from him. One of the dying Athenians reportedly said something to Asterion, a prophecy. Your redeemer is coming. Asterion didn't know what that meant, but from that moment on, he waited. Not with rage, not with hunger, with hope. Now let's talk about Theseus, the hero, the legend, the man Greece celebrated for 1,000 years for slaying the beast of Crete. Here is what the original myth actually says. Theseus didn't fight his way into the labyrinth. He didn't face Asterion in an epic battle of strength and courage. He followed a thread given to him by Ariadne, Asterion's own sister, who had fallen in love with Theseus the moment she saw him. So the legendary hero of Greece entered the labyrinth with a guide thread, found a creature that had been alone for years and killed it, then took Ariadne from her home, sailed away with her, and abandoned her on a deserted island. That is the story they turned into a legend of heroism, but here is the detail that changes everything. Borges found it in the ancient texts, barely noticed, barely mentioned. When Theseus finally reached the center of the labyrinth, when he stood face to face with Asterion, Asterion scarcely defended himself. A creature with the strength of a bull, who had lived alone in darkness for years, who could have fought, who could have tried to survive, didn't, because the ancient texts suggest Asterion welcomed Theseus. The dying Athenian's prophecy echoed in his mind, your redeemer is coming. Asterion thought Theseus was there to save him. He walked toward his own death, believing it was his liberation. Here's where the myth meets the real world. In 1900, British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating on the island of Crete. He found a palace, not a maze, not a labyrinth, but something so vast, over 1,300 rooms, so complex, so disorienting in its layout, that Evans immediately understood why ancient people might have remembered it as an inescapable maze. He named the civilization he found there, the Minoans, after the mythical king Minos. And what he found on the walls was not what he expected. Not images of monsters, not images of human sacrifice, not darkness. He found images of young men and women leaping over bulls, not being killed by them, leaping over them, in a ceremonial ritual, with grace, with precision, with what looked like reverence. The bull in Minoan culture was not a symbol of terror. It was a symbol of power, of the divine, of life itself. Some historians now believe that the tribute Athens sent to Crete was not young people sent to be eaten. It may have been athletes sent to participate in the sacred bull leaping ritual at the palace of Knossos. The Minotaur who devoured Athenian youth may have been a mistranslation, a story told by Athens to explain why they were sending their young people to Crete and didn't want to admit they were doing it as tribute to a more powerful civilization. The monster was not in the labyrinth. The monster was the story told about the labyrinth. His name was Asterion, the Starry One. He was born into a family of kings and queens, imprisoned for something that wasn't his fault, hidden underground so the powerful didn't have to face the consequences of their own greed. He spent years in darkness, playing games alone, talking to shadows, waiting for someone to finally see him as something other than a monster. When that someone finally came, sword in hand, Asterion walked toward him. He didn't fight back, because he didn't understand that his redeemer was just another instrument of the same system that had imprisoned him. The ancient Greeks celebrated Theseus. They built temples to him. They wrote poems about his courage. Nobody wrote poems for Asterion. Nobody built temples for the creature who never chose to be a monster, who was simply born at the wrong moment to the wrong family in a world that needed a villain more than it needed the truth. Here's the question that has been haunting me since I first read this story. How many Asterions are there? How many people throughout history were locked away, hidden, defined by what they looked like rather than who they were? Named monster by the same people who created the conditions that made them so? And how many of them, in their darkest, most alone moment, were still waiting quietly for someone to finally see them? The stars that Asterion was named after, he never once saw them. But they were there, every night, just above the ceiling of his prison, close enough to name him, far enough that he'd never know. Tell me in the comments, was Asterion a monster, or was he the most human figure in all of Greek mythology because he was the only one who never had a choice? If this story changed how you see this myth, share it, because some stories deserve to be heard by people who were never supposed to hear them.